She stood in the middle of my driveway, like she owned the ground under her feet. Her arms were crossed. A paper was taped to my front door, and two men were already walking around my yard placing orange tags on my fence. I had just stepped out of the car after a 14-hour flight. My duffel bag was still on my shoulder. "Excuse me," I said slowly. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" The woman turned around like she had been waiting for that question. Short blonde hair, big sunglasses, that look people get when they think they run the whole neighborhood. "Oh good," she said. "You're finally here. Finally here." I stared at the moving truck parked on the street. My garage door was open. Boxes were inside. My boxes. My heartbeat slowed. The way it does when something is so wrong your brain needs a second to catch up. "I asked a question," I said calmly. She pointed at the paper taped to my door. "You were given multiple notices," she said. "This property was seized and sold by the HOA 2 weeks ago." For a second I thought I heard her wrong. "Sold?" "Yes," she said proudly. "Failure to pay HOA fines for 8 months. Abandoned property. Completely legal." One of the men behind her laughed while dragging a toolbox from my garage. I set my duffel bag down. The paper on the door had my name on it, but the signature at the bottom wasn't mine, and the date was from a month ago. A month ago. I was on deployment. In another country. No phone. No internet. No mail. I slowly looked back at her. "You sold my house," I said. She shrugged. "You should have read your notices." My neighbor across the street was standing outside watching everything. He gave me a small nervous wave, like he felt bad, but didn't want to get involved. Classic. I walked up to the door and pulled the paper down. The HOA letterhead looked real, but the fine amount at the bottom made my eyebrows lift. $23,000 for grass violations, mailbox color, and unauthorized flag display. I almost smiled at that one. "You fined me $23,000, I said quietly. She stepped closer. "Well, technically 30,000 after legal processing." Legal processing. She loved saying that. Behind us, the two workers started pulling more things out of my garage. One grabbed my old motorcycle helmet. The other picked up a box labeled service medals. Something in my chest tightened. "Put that down," I said. The worker looked at the woman, not me. She nodded. "Keep going," she said. That was the moment I understood something. These people didn't think they were doing something risky. They thought they had already won. I stepped back and looked around the street. 3 neighbors were watching now. Phones out, whispering. Probably enjoying the show. The woman checked her watch. "The new owners arrive in 30 minutes, she said. "New owners?" I tilted my head. "You sold it already?" "Oh yes," she said proudly. "Cash beer. HOA approved." Then she leaned a little closer to me. "You should start packing whatever you want to keep. The rest legally belongs to them now." One of the workers kicked open my shed door. Another started stacking my tools near the curb. My tools, my house, my land, all being taken apart like I was already gone. I took a slow breath. "You might want to stop them," I said calmly. She laughed. "Or what?" I looked down at the letter again. Then I looked back at her. "Because that sale you're so proud of," I folded the paper slowly, "is going to cause you a very serious problem." She rolled her eyes. "Oh please. I deal with people like you every month. People like me." I nodded slowly. Then I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Still on airplane mode. I turned it on. Signal came back. 23 missed calls. All from the same number. The base command office. I hit call back. The woman watched me with a bored expression. "Calling a lawyer," she said. Something like that. The phone rang once. Then someone picked up immediately. "Sergeant Miller," the voice said sharply. "Yes, sir." "Where are you right now?" I looked up at the woman standing in my driveway, supervising the theft of my house. "I'm standing in front of my home," I said slowly. Then, I looked at the moving truck. And apparently, my property was sold while I was deployed. There was a long pause on the phone. A very long pause. Then the voice said something that made my eyes drift back to the HOA president. "Stay where you are," the officer said. "Do not leave that property." His tone had changed. Completely. "Understood," I replied. I hung up. The woman smirked. "Well," I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "You said the new owners arrive in 30 minutes. She nodded. "Good," I said. Then I looked down the street, toward the main road. "Because someone else is arriving first." She raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly is that?" I gave a small shrug. "To people who still technically own this land." Her smile widened. "Oh honey," she said, "you lost this house weeks ago." I didn't answer, because far down the street, I could already hear the sound of approaching engines. Not police sirens, something heavier. And when the first dark military SUV turned the corner, that confident smile on her face finally started to fade. The woman's smile stayed on her face for about 3 more seconds. Then the first black SUV rolled slowly onto the street and stopped right in front of my driveway. It wasn't a police car. No lights, no sirens, just a dark vehicle with government plates. Behind it, another one turned the corner. Then another. The whole street went quiet. Neighbors who had been whispering suddenly stopped talking. Phones slowly lifted higher. The HOA president adjusted her sunglasses. "What is this?" she muttered. I didn't answer. The first SUV door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a simple dark uniform. No flashy patches, no big show. But the way he walked, calm and direct, made the 2 workers instantly stop what they were doing. He looked at the boxes in the driveway, then at the open garage, then at me. "Sergeant Miller?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. Then 2 more officers stepped out of the second vehicle. One of them was already holding a folder. The HOA president stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control. "Excuse me," she said loudly. "This is private property. If you're here for him." The house was legally sold. The tall officer slowly turned his head toward her. "And you are?" "I'm Karen Collins," she said confidently, "president of the HOA." He didn't react, didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply held his hand out. "Identification." She blinked. "I don't need to show you." "Identification," he repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made people listen without arguing. She hesitated, then pulled out her wallet and showed her ID. He glanced at it for half a second, then handed it back. Behind him, the second officer had already started looking through the papers on my door. The fake notice, the sale document, the fine list. The officer flipped through them quietly. Then he looked at me. "Did you sign any of these?" "No, sir." "Were you present for any hearing related to this?" "No, sir." The HOA president crossed her arms again. "This isn't a military issue," she said sharply. "He abandoned the property for 8 months." The officer looked at her again. "Abandoned?" "Yes. He ignored every notice we sent." I finally spoke. "I was deployed." She laughed. "That's not my problem." Several neighbors gasped softly. The officer's expression didn't change, but the man beside him slowly closed the folder. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "are you aware Sergeant Miller was deployed under federal orders during that period?" She shrugged. "People say a lot of things." The officer nodded slightly. "All right." He turned to the second officer. "Pull the record." The man already had a tablet in his hand. He tapped the screen twice, then turned it so Karen could see it. "This is the deployment order signed by the Department of Defense," he said. Her face tightened slightly. "That doesn't change the fact he didn't respond to HOA notices." The tall officer spoke again. "Where exactly did you send these notices?" She pointed at the paper. "His mailbox. While he was overseas." "That's not my responsibility." One of the workers quietly put the box of metals back inside the garage. Neither of them wanted to be part of this anymore. The officer looked down the street slowly. More vehicles were arriving. 2 military police trucks this time. Karen noticed them too. Her voice sharpened. "This is ridiculous." The property was already sold. The officer tilted his head slightly. "Sold to who?" "A private beer." "Name?" She hesitated, then said, "That's confidential." The officer looked at the second man. He tapped the tablet again. 5 seconds later he raised his eyebrows. "Well, that's interesting." Karen frowned. "What?" The officer turned the screen toward the tall man. The tall officer exhaled slowly. Then he looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "you sold federally protected property." Her face went blank. "What?" "While the legal owner was deployed under active military orders." She laughed nervously. "That's not possible." But the officer didn't laugh. He simply pointed at my driveway. "This house is protected under the Service Member Civil Relief Act." The name meant nothing to most of the neighbors, but Karen's face slowly lost color. "You cannot seize." He gestured toward the garage. "Fine." Then toward the moving truck. "Or sell property belonging to an active duty service member during deployment without federal court approval." The street went silent. Karen shook her head quickly. No, that's not. The officer cut her off. Did you obtain federal court approval? She didn't answer. Did you verify the owner's military status before initiating seizure? Silence again. The second officer quietly said something that made the situation even worse. Sir, the sale paperwork shows that beer already transferred money to the HOA account. The tall officer looked back at Karen. How much? The officer checked. 460,000. Several neighbors gasped. Karen tried to speak, but the words didn't come out right. That's HOA funds. It's already distributed. The officer slowly nodded. Then he looked at the military police truck that had just stopped behind the SUVs. 2 MPs stepped out. Karen noticed them, and now the panic was starting to show. You can't arrest me, she said quickly. This is a civil issue. The officer looked at her calmly. No, ma'am. He pointed toward the documents. This crossed into federal territory. The moment you interfered with the deploy service members' property rights. She shook her head. This is a misunderstanding. One of the MPs was already walking toward her. You should talk to a lawyer, the tall officer said. Then he added the sentence that made the entire street fall completely silent. Because the beer arriving in 20 minutes. He looked at the tablet again. Is the Department of Defense? Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time since I had pulled into my driveway, she looked small, not angry, not confident, just confused. The Department of Defense, she repeated slowly. The tall officer didn't answer right away. He simply looked around the street again, studying the house, the moving truck, the open garage. Then he nodded slightly to one of the military police officers. Stop the removal of Fanny property. The MP walked straight to the 2 workers. You need to step away from everything you've moved, he said calmly. The workers didn't argue. They dropped what they were holding immediately. One of them even raised his hands like he didn't want any trouble. Hey man, we were just hired, he said nervously. No problem, the MP replied. Just stay by the truck. Karen suddenly found her voice again. This is insane, she snapped. That house was sold legally. The officer turned back toward her. Then you won't mind if we verify every step of that sale. Her jaw tightened. You're overstepping. No ma'am, he said quietly. You did. A small crowd had formed on the sidewalks now. Neighbors who usually stayed behind curtains were fully outside. Phones were pointed toward the driveway. No one wanted to miss what was happening. Across the street, old Mr. Dawson slowly walked closer to the curb. He had lived here longer than anyone. He looked at me, then at Karen. Then he shook his head slowly. I told you this was a bad idea, he muttered. Karen whipped around. You stay out of this. But Dawson didn't move. You never listen, he said calmly. Not when it matters. The tall officer stepped toward my front door and examined the lock. It had been replaced. I hadn't even noticed until now. He turned back toward Karen. Did you authorize a lock change? Yes, she said quickly. Standard procedure after foreclosure. Foreclosure requires a court order. She crossed her arms again. The HOA has authority. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked down the driveway toward the open garage. Boxes sat everywhere. My tools. My equipment. Years of my life scattered around like yard sale leftovers. He stopped near the box labeled service metals. The lid had fallen slightly open. Inside were ribbons, patches, and frame citations. The officer looked inside the box for a moment, then gently closed it. When he turned back toward Karen, something about his expression had changed. You were informed this homeowner was military, he said. Karen shook her head immediately. No, we weren't. Across the street, Mr. Dawson spoke again. That's not true. Karen spun toward him. What did you say? Dawson pointed toward my mailbox. The day those notices started showing up. I told you he was deployed. The street got quiet again. Karen's eyes widened. That's not. You said you didn't care. Dawson continued calmly. You said rules were rules. A few neighbors nodded. They remembered that conversation too. Karen looked around quickly, realizing more witnesses were now paying attention. That's not proof of anything, she said sharply. The officer spoke again. But it is a statement. One of the MPs had already started writing something down. Karen noticed. Are you documenting this? She demanded. Yes, the MP replied. She laughed nervously. You're acting like this is a crime. The tall officer looked directly at her. Right now we're determining whether it is. A second MP walked over holding a printed sheet. Sir, I checked the HOA registration. The officer took the paper. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Karen noticed. What? She asked. The officer turned the paper so she could see it. Your HOA doesn't have authority to conduct property seizure. Her face stiffened. That's wrong. It expired 2 years ago. That's impossible. Your association never renewed its county enforcement status. Karen's confidence cracked for a moment. That's a clerical error. The officer didn't argue. Instead he asked a very simple question. Who signed the sale documents? She hesitated, then said, I did. The officer nodded slowly. And where is the money now? It's already been distributed to HOA operations. How much remains in the account? She didn't answer. The officer looked at the MP with the tablet. Check. The MP tapped the screen for a few seconds. Then he spoke. Less than 12,000. A few neighbors whispered to each other. Karen tried to stay calm. That money was used for community improvements. The officer tilted his head slightly. What improvements? She gestured vaguely around the street. Maintenance. Landscaping. Mr. Dawson laughed quietly. What landscaping? He said. The officer glanced toward him. You're a resident here. 31 years. Have you seen HOA improvements recently? Dawson shook his head. Only fines. Several neighbors nodded again. Karen was losing control of the conversation. This is harassment, she snapped. You can't interrogate residents like this. But the officer ignored the outburst. Instead he turned back toward me. Sergeant Miller, when did you purchase this home? 7 years ago. Mortgage paid? Yes, sir. No liens? None. He nodded. Then he looked at the tablet again. Title records confirm that. Karen spoke quickly. That doesn't matter once foreclosure. There was no foreclosure, the officer said calmly. Silence. Karen looked around the street again. The same neighbors who used to nod along with her during HOA meetings were now watching quietly, phones still recording. One of the MPs suddenly raised his hand. Sir? Yes? We just received confirmation from the county clerk. What kind of confirmation? The property transfer filed by the HOA was flagged an hour ago. Karen's head snapped toward him. Flagged for what? The MP read from the screen. Fraud review. The street went completely silent. Karen's breathing changed. That's ridiculous, she said weakly. The tall officer folded his arms. The county says the title transfer violated federal protection laws. Karen shook her head over and over. This is a misunderstanding. But the officer wasn't looking at her anymore. He was watching the end of the street. Another vehicle had just turned the corner. Not a military SUV, a dark government sedan. 2 men stepped out wearing suits. The officer nodded slightly. Here they are. Karen followed his gaze. Who? Legal division. Her face went pale. The 2 men walked up the driveway slowly. One carried a thin briefcase. The other had a stack of documents. They stopped beside the officer. Lieutenant Harris, one of them said. Good afternoon. The officer nodded. Perfect timing. The man with the briefcase looked around the driveway, the boxes, the moving truck, the workers standing awkwardly near the curb. Then he looked at Karen. You are Karen Collins? She swallowed. Yes. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a document. Ma'am, I represent the Department of Defense Property Protection Division. She blinked rapidly. I don't understand what that has to do with this. He handed her the paper. This home is listed under protected military housing assets due to the owner's active deployment status. Her hands shook slightly as she looked at the page. That protection began 8 months ago. Her eyes moved across the document. The moment the HOA attempted to seize the property, the action became federally reviewable. She looked up slowly. What does that mean? The man spoke calmly. It means the sale you conducted is void. Karen's lips parted. But the beer? Yes, he said. We're aware. Her voice cracked slightly. You said the beer was the Department of Defense. He nodded. We purchased the property during the fraud review process to prevent illegal transfer. Her brain struggled to catch up. So, you bought it? Temporarily. The officer added quietly. Protective acquisition. Karen stared at both of them. So the sale still stands. The man shook his head. No. He took another document from the briefcase. The transaction was immediately frozen and redirected to federal investigation. Karen looked down at the paper again, then back at him. You're saying? The man finished the sentence for her. You attempted to sell property that legally could not be sold. Karen's breathing became shallow. That's not a crime. The man closed the briefcase slowly. It becomes one when money is collected under false authority. The MP with the tablet spoke quietly. Sir, the HOA account shows multiple transfers to a personal account. Karen spun around. That's for operational reimbursement. The officer raised an eyebrow. $72,000. Her face drained of color again. The MP turned the screen so the legal officer could see. He studied it quietly, then nodded once. Thank you. Karen took a step backward. You're twisting this. But the legal officer's voice stayed calm. Mrs. Collins, the funds you accepted from the sale were federal property the moment the house was protected under diplomat status. Her hands started shaking. That's impossible. The officer looked at the MPs. Secure the financial records. One of them immediately began making a call. Karen suddenly looked desperate. This is ridiculous. I'll call my lawyer. No problem, the legal officer said. But first we need to clarify something. He pointed toward the driveway. You authorized entry onto this property? Yes. You ordered personal belongings removed? Yes. You signed documents transferring ownership? Yes. Every answer came out weaker than the last. The legal officer nodded. Thank you. Karen frowned. For what? For confirming the statements on record. She froze. The MP who had been writing notes closed his pad. Then the tall officer spoke again. Ma'am, at this point we're going to ask you to remain here. Her eyes widened. Wide? The officer's voice stayed calm. Because federal investigators are on their way. She shook her head rapidly. This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong. The legal officer looked at the boxes in the driveway again, then at the neighbors filming everything, then back at her. You'll have plenty of time to explain that. At that moment, another vehicle turned onto the street. This one had blue federal plates. Two investigators stepped out. Karen watched them walk toward the house. Her confident HOA smile was completely gone now. One of the investigators looked around the driveway, then at the documents, then at the box of service medals. He sighed quietly. Then he looked at Karen and said something that made several neighbors gasp. Mrs. Collins, he held up a badge. We're opening a federal fraud investigation. And suddenly, the woman who thought she owned the neighborhood realized the neighborhood was watching her fall apart. Karen looked around like the ground under her feet had just disappeared. A few minutes earlier she had been giving orders in my driveway. Now two federal investigators were standing in front of her. And the entire street was watching. Phones everywhere. No one was whispering anymore. Everyone was openly recording. This is a mistake, Karen said quickly. You're blowing this way out of proportion. One of the investigators calmly opened a small folder. We're just going to ask a few questions, he said. That's all. But the way he said it made it clear those questions were not optional. Karen forced a smile. Fine. The investigator pointed at the documents still taped to my door. You issued these notices? Yes. Under HOA authority? Yes. Did you verify whether the homeowner was under military protection before issuing them? Her voice dropped slightly. No. The second investigator wrote something down. The first one continued. You authorized a property seizure? Yes. You changed the locks? Yes. You signed the sale documents? Yes. Each answer made the air heavier. The investigator nodded slowly. Thank you. Karen crossed her arms again. I still don't see a crime. The tall military officer spoke calmly. Attempting to seize protected military property. The investigator added quietly, collecting money from an illegal sale. Then the MP with the tablet stepped forward and transferring HOA funds into a personal account. Karen snapped her head toward him. That's reimbursement. But the investigator's voice stayed steady. $72,000 is a lot of reimbursement, the neighbors murmured. Karen's face turned red. You don't understand how HOA finances work. Mr. Dawson spoke from across the street. Oh, we understand, he said. We've been paying those fines for years. Karen pointed at him. You've been violating rules for years. Dawson chuckled. No, Karen, we've been funding you. The investigator raised a hand. Let's keep this focused. Then he looked back at Karen. Where exactly did the money from this sale go? Karen hesitated. It was distributed. To who? She didn't answer. The MP turned the tablet around again. Half went to the HOA account. He scrolled. The other half went to an account under your name. The street went quiet again. Karen looked like she wanted to argue. but the words wouldn't come. The investigator closed his folder slowly. Mrs. Collins, we're going to need you to come with us so we can review these transactions. Her eyes widened. Come with you? Yes. This is voluntary at the moment. The way he said at the moment made several neighbors exchange looks. Karen tried to stand tall again. I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer. That's fine, the investigator said calmly. You're welcome to contact one. She pulled out her phone quickly. Her hands were shaking now. The confident HOA president everyone feared during meetings was gone. While she stepped aside to make the call, the tall officer walked over to me. Sergeant Miller. Yes, sir. I apologize you had to come home to this. I looked at the boxes in my driveway. My neighbors caught a show at least. He gave a small smile. Then he nodded toward the legal officer. We'll handle restoring the title immediately. Thank you. The legal officer spoke next. The sale is already void. Your property will be fully returned today. One of the MPS had already started helping the workers move things back into the garage. The workers didn't complain. They looked relieved. One of them even said quietly to me, "Sorry man, we thought it was a normal foreclosure job." No problem, I said. Across the driveway, Karen finished her phone call. Her voice had changed. She walked back toward the investigators slowly. My lawyer says you can't arrest me without proof. The investigator nodded. He's correct. Her confidence came back for half a second. Good. Then the investigator continued. That's why we're collecting it right now. Her smile disappeared again. The MP stepped forward. Sir, the county clerk just confirmed something. What is it? The HOA filed 5 other property seizure attempts over the last year. Karen's head snapped toward him. That's not relevant. The MP continued reading. 3 of them involved elderly homeowners. The neighbors started whispering again. Karen pointed at the MP. You're twisting things. But the investigator simply asked, did those homeowners attend foreclosure hearings? Karen froze. The MP answered for her. There were no hearings. Another long silence fell over the street. The investigator sighed. Then he spoke quietly. Mrs. Collins, this situation is getting bigger. She shook her head. This is harassment. The investigator looked toward the MPS. Collect the HOA financial records. 2 MPS immediately walked toward Karen's car parked down the street. She stepped in front of them. You can't touch that. The investigator held up a paper. We can. Her shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time, she looked scared. 15 minutes passed. More neighbors came outside. The whole street now looked like a small crowd, watching the end of a long movie. Finally, one of the MTS returned holding a small box of documents. Sir. The investigator opened the box. Inside were bank papers, receipts, HOA records. He flipped through them slowly. Then he looked up at Karen. You really should have hired a better accountant. Her voice cracked. What does that mean? He pulled out one paper. Because this shows HOA funds paying your personal mortgage. The street exploded with murmurs. Karen looked like she had been punched in the stomach. That's temporary reimbursement. The investigator didn't respond. He simply handed the paper to the other investigator. They both read it quietly. Then the first investigator looked back at Karen. Mrs. Collins, his voice was calm but final. At this point we're no longer asking you to stay voluntarily. The MP stepped forward. Karen's eyes widened. You're arresting me for suspected fraud, illegal property seizure, and misuse of association funds. The MP gently took her wrist. You have the right to remain silent. The neighbors were completely silent now, phones held high. Karen looked around the street one last time. The same neighbors she had fined for mailbox colors, gross height, parking rules. Now they were watching her being placed in handcuffs. She looked directly at me. This isn't over, she said weakly. I shrugged. I think it is. The MPS led her toward the federal vehicle. As the door closed behind her, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. Then Mr. Dawson slowly clapped once. Just one clap. A few neighbors laughed. Others shook their heads. The tall officer walked back toward me. Your locks will be changed back today. Appreciate it. The legal officer added. And the HOA authority here is being suspended pending investigation. That news moved through the crowd like electricity. Several neighbors actually smiled for the first time. Years of petty fines, random threats, fake notices, all of it suddenly looked very different. I picked up the box labeled service metals and carried it back inside the garage. The officer watched for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You know, most people would have panicked when they saw their house being emptied." I shrugged. I figured the truth would catch up eventually. He nodded. "Still, you handled it calmly." I looked at the street, at the neighbors who had watched everything. "At some point," I said, "you learn that people who abuse power usually make one big mistake." "What's that?" "They think no one stronger is watching." He smiled slightly. The federal vehicles began leaving one by one. The moving truck drove away empty. My driveway slowly returned to normal. Before leaving, the officer turned back once more. "Sergeant Miller." "Yes, sir." "Welcome home." I looked at the house. The same porch. The same door. The same flag still hanging beside the garage. "I didn't fight for this country," I said quietly, "just to be told I can't live in my own house." Across the street, Mr. Dawson raised his coffee mug to the man who just ended Karen's HOA empire. A few neighbors laughed, and for the first time since I had returned home, the street finally felt like mine again.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories.